Esophagus is a long, hollow muscular tube of around 18 to 26 centimeters in length, which acts as a conduit for passage of food bolus from the mouth to the stomach. Normally, it's in a collapsed state, but with the food bolus consumption, food bolus, it can distend to a diameter of anteroposteriorly 2 centimeter and transversely around 3 centimeters. It is located in the posterior mediastinum and at the level of thoracic vertebra 10 leaves a thorax through the hiatus within the right crus of the diaphragm. Unlike the rest of the GI tract, it has no serosa and is constituted with 4 layers, that is innermost mucosa, submucosa, muscularis propria, and outermost adventitia. Coming to the musculature, upper one-third is exclusively of skeletal muscles, while the distal 50% is constituted with smooth muscles. The muscular layer is arranged in a fashion of inner circular and outer longitudinal layers. It has 2 sphincters, the upper esophageal sphincter, which is made of cricopharyngeus and the inferior constrictor, and the lower esophageal sphincter, which is a 3 to 4 centimeters segment of tonically contracted smooth muscle. The lower esophageal sphincter is contracted at rest, and the esophagogastric junction has a high pressure zone, which is contributed by mainly 3 factors, that is lower esophageal sphincter tone, the pressure caused by the crura of the diaphragm, and the intrinsic tone of the gastric cardia. Normally, the resting lower esophageal sphincter tone is between 10 to 30 millimeters of mercury relative to the intragastric pressure. Coming to nervous innervation, it is controlled by both parasympathetic and sympathetic. So parasympathetic is through the vagus nerve in the form of nucleus ambiguous, which controls the skeletal muscle, and the dorsal motor nucleus of vagus, which controls the smooth muscle. The sympathetic nerve supply is with the thoracic sympathetic nerves. The sensory signals also travel via vagus nerve through the nucleus of tractus solitarius and then to the nucleus ambiguous and dorsal motor nucleus, from where efferents come to the musculature of the esophagus. Coming to the swallowing, the function of the esophagus is to transport the ingested material from the pharynx to the stomach by peristaltic waves. This happens in the form of primary peristalsis, secondary peristalsis. The primary peristalsis is triggered by the swallow and it traverses the entire length of the esophagus, which travels, and this contraction wave travels at a speed of 2 centimeters per second. Now, the secondary peristalsis is induced when food bolus is retained in the esophagus, which causes distension, and also sometimes the reflex materials also triggers the secondary peristalsis. Its main role is to clear the esophagus from retained bolus. Tertiary peristalsis it's a misnomer. These are not peristaltic contractions and play no physiological role. It is frequently observed in elderly people, where it is called as stress by esophagus, and also seen in motility disorders. Coming to the classification, primarily it is classified as disorders of pharyngoesophageal junction, disorders of body, and disorders of lower esophageal sphincter. Disorders of pharyngoesophageal junction mainly are neurological and myogenic. Neurological include stroke, motor neuron disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, and myogenic include myasthenia, muscular dystrophy, pharyngoesophageal diverticulum or Zenker's diverticulum. Disorders of body include diffuse esophageal spasm, nutcracker esophagus, autoimmune diseases like scleroderma, reflux-associated, idiopathic, allergic, eosinophilic. Disorders of the lower esophageal sphincter include echalacia and incompetent lower esophageal sphincter, that is gastroesophageal reflux disease. Coming to the motility disorders of the esophagus per se, which is echalacia, which I'll be concentrating more for lack of time. And echalacia, it's defined by American Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy as a primary esophageal motor disorder of unknown etiology characterized by degeneration of the myenteric plexus, which results in impaired relaxation of esophagogastric junction, along with loss of organized peristalsis in the body. The main one of the hypotheses is that there's a loss of Auerbach ganglion cells from the wall of esophagus, which starts from the lower esophageal sphincter and progresses proximally. This causes esophageal wall aperistalsis, leading to stasis of food and subsequent dilatation. It is the incidence is equal in both males and females, and is seen in 25 years to 60 years of age group. Onset is usually very gradual and slowly progressive. So the average duration from symptoms is to the diagnosis usually at least 2 years. The main hallmark symptom is a dysphagia to both solids and liquids, which is the most common symptom also. And other symptoms include regurgitation, weight loss, chest pain, and heartburn. The other disorders include distal esophageal spasm, which is characterized by simultaneous repetitive high-pressure muscular contraction within the esophagus. This is probably related to the fragmental degeneration of the vagal nerves. Mainly, the presentation would be a chest pain, which may even mimic an angina due to esophageal distension, and sometimes also because of esophageal reflux. And the characteristic is another category is a dysphagia to both solids and liquids. Hypercontractile esophagus. These are the vigorous esophageal contractions with normal propagation associated with both dysphagia and chest pain. The pathophysiology is unknown, but it is hypothesized to be related to excessive cholinergic activity or to reactive compensation for increased outflow obstruction leading to myocyte hypertrophy. The current version of Chicago classification refers to as jackhammer esophagus. Coming to the scleroderma esophagus, it's a collagen vascular disease where almost 80% of the patients affected with scleroderma have involvement of esophagus, which is predominantly distal 2/3 of the esophagus. There's mainly gradual loss of peristalsis and weakening of the lower esophageal sphincter, which causes gastroesophageal reflux disease. The clinical presentation is mainly of the reflux symptoms, that is heartburn, regurgitation, and dysphagia. The another entity is called the pseudoachalasia, which mimics achalasia. These are the causes usually include the primary malignancy of esophagus or esophagogastric junction, and secondary malignancies like metastasis from lung or breast, and other benign disorders like mesenchymal tumors, secondary amyloidosis, or peripheral neuropathy, and sometimes even post-operative complication following anti-reflex surgery. Other rare disorders are neurological disorders, infiltration of the ileus by the lymphoma, and other paraneoplastic syndromes. Next component is the diagnosis of the esophageal motility disorders. Diagnosis is mainly by radiologic imaging, endoscopy, and manometry. Chest X-ray also gives some clues regarding the motility disorders, like findings of dilated esophagus in the form of widened mediastinum, air fluid level in the dilated esophagus, which is predominantly retrocardiac, and because of the tight lower esophageal sphincter, the gas may not enter into the stomach, so the gastric air bubble may be small or sometimes even absent. And sometimes other secondary complication of achalasia like pneumonitis, aspiration pneumonitis can also be seen. This is a chest X-ray showing a widened mediastinum because of the esophageal dilatation. This is another X-ray which shows a dilated esophagus along with the air fluid level in the dilated esophagus. Coming to the contrast imaging, barium esophagogram can provide useful information regarding function, peristalsis, and bolus clearance to the esophagogastric junction. The characteristic abnormalities which are seen in barium esophagogram are bird's beak deformity and a dilated esophagus, while in distal esophageal spasm, we see a corkscrew esophagus pattern. This is a barium swallow which is showing a dilated esophagus with a narrowing bird beak appearance in the distal esophagus. And this is another barium swallow which is showing the typical corkscrew appearance of the esophagus. There's another thing called as timed barium esophagogram, which is in which the procedure is similar to barium swallow, but X-rays are taken at 1 minute, 2 minutes, and 5 minutes. The primary use of this is to study the emptying of the esophagus, and also we can have a subjective assessment of the severity of the achalasia in the form of height and width of the barium column. This can be used as a treatment response, measuring the height, comparing the height and width of the barium column. The treatment is considered a responsive if there is 50% or more reduction in the post-treatment height at 1 5-minute X-rays, and if it is less than 50% height reduction, it's considered as failure. Endoscopy is mandatory to rule out pseudoachalasia, other mechanical obstruction. Combines the ability to detect most structural causes of dysphagia, and also it gives advantage of getting biopsies, or therapeutic also can be planned in the same session in the form of dilatation of a stricture or a mucosal ring. But the limitation is in assessing extraluminal structures and other secondary causes of achalasia, and also it might be normal in early achalasia. This is the endoscopic images showing the dilated esophagus and remnant food bolus along with the stasis esophagitis and physiological narrowing of the lower esophageal sphincter that typically opens up with the pop while passing across the OG junction. And these are the abnormal peristalsis which are visible here. Coming to the manometer, which is important investigation in esophageal motility disorders. It was studied in early 1990s by the Klaus and Steino. There are two types predominantly now at present: water perfusion manometry or solid state manometry, which are again classified as standard and high resolution manometry. This is the solid state manometry device, and this is the water perfused manometry device. These are some of the catheters which are used. This is the optical catheter, and this is the water perfused silicone catheter, and another solid state catheter, and this again the water perfused silicone catheter, and these are the optical sensors in the manometry catheter. Coming to the esophageal manometry, this is investigation where intraluminal pressure sensors are positioned within the esophagus. When it is coupled with sophisticated algorithms, manometric data is displayed as pressure topographic plots. The main important measurement is made in this is the declusive EGJ relaxation. Incomplete EGJ relaxation is an essential feature in the diagnosis of achalasia. So some of the metrics which are used in manometry are this: the IRP, which measures the lowest pressure in the lower esophageal sphincter in the 4 seconds that follows, which may be continuous or discontinuous following a swallow. The next important thing is that contractile deceleration point, that is CDP, is the point at which the speed of the wavefront decreases. And this is the point where the food bolus starts entering the ampulla of the esophagus, leading to passing across the lower esophageal sphincter. And distal latency is the duration between the onset of swallow and the CDP, that is contractile deceleration point. When distal latency is less than 4.5 seconds, it is called as a premature contraction. The next important metric is the distal contractile integral, that is DCI, which gives us an estimation of the vigor of the esophageal contraction. It is the average amplitude of contraction within the isobaric contour. It is called as failed contraction when DCI is less than 100, and a weak contraction if it is DCI is between 100 to 450, and hypercontractile if it is more than 8,000. And when it is between 450 to 8,000, it is called as normal. This is a Chicago 3.0 classification for motility disorders. It is mainly classified into disorders with esophageal outflow obstruction, major disorders of peristalsis, minor disorders of peristalsis, and normal. And among the disorders with EGJ outflow obstruction, it is classified again as achalasia and EGJ outflow obstruction. The main characteristic is that the IRP is elevated in both of these. Now, the main distinguishing factor is between these two is that IRP is elevated in achalasia and there are abnormalities of peristalsis, whereas here IRP is elevated but it's not not fitting into the criteria for achalasia. So among achalasia, there are 3 types, among which the type 1 is where the IRP is increased and there is no peristaltic activity, and type 2 IRP is increased and there is panesophageal pressurization, and this is type 3 where IRP is increased along with the spastic contractions. More than 20% of swallows should have spastic contractions. Then coming to the next type, the esophagogastric outflow obstruction, where IRP is elevated and is not fitting into the other types of achalasia. The major disorders of peristalsis are distal esophageal spasm, jackhammer esophagus, and absent contractility. Here the IRP will be normal, but there are abnormalities of peristalsis, which can be if more than 20% of swallows are premature, then it is called as distal esophageal spasm. And if more than 20% of swallows are more than 8,000, then it is called as jackhammer esophagus. And when there is no visible contraction, then there is absent contractility. Coming to the minor disorders, where more than 50% of ineffective swallows are ineffective motility, and when more than 50% of fragmented swallows and are not effective, that is called as fragmented peristalsis. The radionuclide studies, this also an important investigation, which is a non-invasive method of studying esophageal function, and there are no false negative reports, and a good agreement between this study and manometry results. So it's also sensitive, but limitations include cost and availability. This is the clinical scoring system for achalasia called as ICAT score, which constitutes weight loss, dysphagia, retrosternal pain, and regurgitation. This score is used to assess the response of the therapeutic intervention. When the score is less than 3, then it's called as a success, clinical success. Coming to the treatment, achalasia, the treatment is mainly aimed at reducing the LES, lower esophageal sphincter pressure, as gravity promotes the esophageal emptying. But the peristalsis rarely returns with therapy. So the main modalities of decreasing the lower esophageal sphincter pressure are pharmacological, pneumatic dilatation, botulinum toxin, POEM, that is peroral endoscopic myotomy, and surgical myotomy. Pharmacological treatment drugs which are used as smooth muscle relaxants like nitrates and calcium channel blockers. These relieve dysphagia by reducing sphincter pressures. The drugs include isosorbate dinitrate, calcium channel blockers like nifedipine, phosphodiesterase inhibitors like sildenafil. The other modality is the botulinum toxin. This is mainly reserved for older adults or frail individuals who are not poor candidates for surgery. Here, the botulinum toxin irreversibly inhibits the release of acetylcholine from presynaptic cholinergic terminals, effectively eliminating neurogenic component of lower esophageal sphincter pressure. It is injected into the lower esophageal sphincter, and it's a safe method with decent clinical success of around 77% 6 months follow-up. But the main limitation is durability, as this there is recurrence of the symptoms. Pneumatic dilatation. Here, the reduction of LES pressure is by partially disrupting the circular muscle fibers of the sphincter. The best predictor of efficacy is the post-dilatation lower esophageal sphincter pressure. If it is less than 10 millimeters, then it is associated with prolonged remission. If it is more than 20, it predicts little benefit. Meta-analysis of 52 studies showed that there's a good success with pneumatic dilatation when relapse rates are around 30 to 50% follow, and the median time to relapse is 5 to 11 years. Ehlers myotomy is described by Heller in 1913 with a good clinical results of 60 to 100%, and overall mortality is less than 2%. From there on, multiple modifications have been made, and now the current preferred surgical procedure is laparoscopic Heller myotomy, along with a combination of partial fundoplication, either by method of Tobey or Doerr. Laparoscopic Ehlers myotomy has a symptomatic improvement of almost 90% at 40 months, and with adverse event of gastroesophageal reflux with the rate of around 11 to 15%, and around 5 to 15% have recurrence or persistent symptoms. Whenever there is a post-Ehlers myotomy failure, traditional pneumatic dilatation has been done with a response rate of 50 to 75%. Sometimes even repeat laparoscopic Ehlers also can be done with a clinical success of 90 to 100%. Nowadays, even POEM has been considered for post-Ehlers myotomy failure. Coming to the recent modality, which is a peroral endoscopic myotomy, Inouye first introduced this procedure in 2010, and in his first paper, he has claimed 100% success in all the 17 patients in that study. In a meta-analysis which showed a clinical success rate of almost 98% with considerable improvement in all of the scores, and overall adverse event rate was around 7.5%. This is the POEM animation. And the overall short-term, mid-term follow-up rate, their adverse events were 0.5 to 3.3%, with commonest adverse events related to insufflation, which has been eliminated while using the CO2 gas instead of air. Another complications include perforation, bleeding, subcutaneous emphysema, pneumothorax, pneumomediastinum, pneumoperitoneum, pleural effusion, and the most important adverse effect is the gastroesophageal reflux disease by symptoms, it's around 8%. Case of treatment failures in the pneumatic dilatation, especially after 5 to 7 years, around 30% will need retreatment, and similar percentage is required retreatment in Ehlers patients as well after 5.5 years. Now, the consideration of POEM after therapeutic failure, especially after pneumatic dilatation or botulinum injection, long-term outcomes are similar to a primary POEM. And POEM after failed laparoscopic Ehlers also had a clinical success of 90 to 100%. In a study which compared POEM with prior Heller and without prior Ehlers, showed no difference in technical success, but clinical success was slightly lower in the post-Ehlers group. Comparing pneumatic dilatation and botulinum toxin, overall pneumatic dilatation was more effective in the long term, as there is increased recurrence following the botulinum toxin injection. Comparing pneumatic dilatation versus laparoscopic Ehlers, both had no significant difference at 2 years or 5 years follow-up, so both can be considered as initial treatment of achalasia. Comparing POEM and pneumatic dilatation, clinical success at 12 months, POEM is 93% and pneumatic dilatation is 72%. There's higher treatment success at 2 years in POEM group as compared to pneumatic dilatation group. But the main problem is the symptomatic and endoscopic gastroesophageal reflux in POEM group. Comparing POEMs and laparoscopic Ehlers, this meta-analysis did not show any significant difference in the procedural times, or and there are similar adverse event rates, length of hospital stay, and gastroesophageal reflux symptoms. Both laparoscopic Ehlers and POEMs are acceptable treatment modalities in the management of achalasia. This is the current management flowchart in 2020. Whenever there's symptoms of achalasia, it has to be confirmed with endoscopy, time-varying esophagogram, and high-resolution manometry. CT and EUS can also be considered to rule out other causes of dysphagia. If the patient is a low surgical risk and it's a type 1 or type 2 achalasia, and it's especially if a young type 1 achalasia, then POEMs or laparoscopic HELLAS would be the procedure of choice. And in case of the type 2 achalasia, then either pneumatic dilatation, POEM, or laparoscopic HELLAS would be the procedure of choice. In case it's a type 3 HELLAS, then POEM with a long myotomy should be done. In case these all procedures has failure, then repeat pneumatic dilatation or POEM or redo laparoscopic LS can be considered. And in case the treatment is resistant and there's a dilated sigmoid esophagus, then esophagectomy should be considered. If the patient is a high-risk candidate, then botulinum toxin or only medical management should be done. In case of distal esophageal spasm, anxiolytics can be used and reassurance and with behavioral modification, biofeedback can be considered. But is still resistant, then dilatation with Buji dilators or surgical therapy can be considered. In hypercontractile esophagus or jackhammer esophagus, smooth muscle relaxants like calcium channel blockers and nitrates and other drugs like sildenafil can be used. In also botulinum toxin injection has also been tried, and because this is mostly associated with psychological distress, low dose tricyclic antidepressants can also be used. In case of absent peristalsis, mainly the treatment will be lifestyle modifications like postural maneuvers and also using a liberal amount of liquids while eating. And these patients will require a higher dose PPA than recommended by the standard FDA. In scleroderma esophagus, the main problems and issues are the sphincter incompetence, aperistalsis, stricture, Barrett's esophagus, and rarely adenocarcinoma. So it's essential that the reflux should be prevented because these reflux is incompletely cleared because of the lack of peristalsis, though there is higher risk of all these consequences. So one of the most common complications is the fusiform stricture, which is 4 to 5 centimeter above the gastroesophageal junction. So PPAs or proton pump inhibitor should be started earlier in these patients. And whenever the PPA is stopped, then the relapse of symptoms is literally 100%. Take home message will be achalasia is mainly the inadequate relaxation of esophagus and abnormal peristalsis combination, and the diagnosis is by high resolution manometry, and time barium esophagogram is useful to assess response objectively. Laparoscopic HELLAS, pneumatic dilatation, POEM are all effective therapeutic modalities in patients with achalasia, and decision between these treatment options should be dependent on achalasia type, local expertise, and patient preference. And in case of absent peristalsis, only lifestyle modification should be considered. These are my references. Thank you.
So I can see Dr. Manoj is already there. If he can unmute himself.
Like manometric and non-manometric diagnosis is there. And usually it is done in two positions. Its recommendation is probably supine and upright position you will have to do. And ineffective esophageal contractions also, that it is more well defined. So 3 or 4 points is the difference.
So as you rightly said, possibly multiple rapid swallowing has been incorporated in Chicago 4 classification before you classify something as ineffective peristalsis. And I think the other difference which needs to be highlighted is that in Chicago 3, as Dr. Ravi showed, that there was major and minor, which has been removed in Chicago 4, and it basically differentiates ineffective peristalsis, gastric outlet, EG junction outflow obstruction, rather than having major and minor motility disorders. I think these are some of the changes which have taken place in Chicago 4. I'm so used to Chicago 3, it will take some time before we start with Chicago 4. Any further comments on that? So there are some other questions. Can you look at the chat?
Hi, sir. And they've asked when is the multiple rapid swallows and semi-solid swallows, when it is recommended. Dr. Ravi Kiran? When is multiple rapid swallows and semi-solid swallows recommended?
I think the basic difference is that nowadays with Chicago 4, there is more stringent definition of ineffective peristalsis. And so before you talk about ineffective peristalsis, you should do these maneuvers, and so that the diagnosis is more stringent. The other thing is in the Chicago 4 is also that when you talk of EGAOO or spasm or hyperperistaltic esophagus, now we realize that the patient must be symptomatic either by dysphagia or by non-cardiac chest pain. And it's not only manometric diagnosis, but symptomatic diagnosis included. You define them into these categories. There is a question of how to follow up achalasia after POEM procedure.
Patients must be asked for to report for follow-up for again doing a time variant esophagogram, and then we can assess the response using that.
Are you aware of the instrument or procedure which can be done to look at the response? Dr. Manoj, do you have any comments?
I'm not very sure, sir.
So, what's the difference in solid state and the liquid state manometry?
In liquid state manometry, usually water is used for the perfusion of the catheters. And the solid state, there'll be no water, it's just the optical fiber cables.
Which is better? Which one is better?
Solid state manometry would be better.
Okay.
Temperature differences for the water and the perfusion pressure has to be maintained in the water. Just, and repeated calibrations for the temperature of the water and all those things have to be.
So I think one of the major problems with the POEM, which you did not discuss in detail, was reflux. And now we know that there is an additional procedure which can be combined, which is POEM with fundoplication, yes, to reduce the risk of reflux. All right, so I think should we move on to the second presentation? We have just completed 30 minutes. Dr. Hemamala,
Yes,
sorry.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Ravikiran. Thank you, sir. So next, I invite Shiny Thompson, our first year DND to interpretation of abnormal liver function test. Sir.
Good evening, sir. Are my slides visible, sir?
At least I can't see it as yet.
No, we can't see Shiny.
We can see your desktop.
Okay. Open the presentation.
Yeah, now we can see.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Shiny Thompson, I would like to thank MD for allowing me to for giving me this opportunity to present a topic on interpretation of LFT. And I'd like to thank my moderator, Professor Dr. Murli sir and Dr. Hema ma'am and Dr. Manoj sir for guiding me through this presentation. I'll be discussing this topic on the following headings: introduction, classification of liver function tests, evaluation of isolated hyperbilirubinemia, approach to elevated transaminases, evaluation of isolated alkaline phosphatase elevation, synthetic functions of the liver, and conclusion. The term liver biochemical tests are now preferred to liver function tests, as the commonly done tests are not the true measures of hepatic function. They are the indirect markers to identify hepatobiliary disease, to distinguish among different types of liver disease, to gauge the progression of a known liver disease, and monitor response to the treatment given. Liver function tests can be classified according to the following functions based on excretory, metabolic function, synthetic function, detoxification function, and storage function. These are the tests based on excretory function: serum bilirubin, total direct bilirubin, indirect bilirubin, urine and fecal urobilinogen, urine bile salts, dye excretion tests. Tests based on detoxification function include hippuric acid test, determination of blood ammonia levels. The tests based on metabolic functions include galactose tolerance test, serum cholesterol levels, serum protein and amino aciduria. Tests based on synthetic functions include plasma protein levels and prothrombin time. Coming to the metabolism of bilirubin. Bilirubin is a breakdown product of heme, and about 4 milligrams per kg is synthesized every day. And from heme, 80% of it is synthesized from the heme and 20% from the cytochromes. From heme, it is converted to biliverdin with the help of heme oxygenase enzyme, and from biliverdin, it is reduced with the help of biliverdin reductase enzyme to bilirubin. This is secreted this is synthesized in the this bilirubin is water insoluble, and this process up to this takes place in the reticuloendothelial system. And this to make this soluble in water, this bilirubin is bound to albumin, and this enters the endothelial side of the hepatocytes. And once it enters the hepatocytes, it is conjugated with the help of UDP glucuronidase transferase enzyme, and this conjugated bilirubin is excreted into the bile through multi-drug resistant protein, which is an energy dependent process. This conjugated bilirubin is water soluble, and it is excreted into the bile. Once it reaches the distal ileum and colon, it is degraded by the intestinal microbes to form urobilinogen, and it is either excreted as such or it is oxidized into urobilin. And some part of it enters the enterohepatic circulation, and it is excreted in the same way as said above, and some remaining portion is excreted renally. Coming to the causes of isolated hyperbilirubinemia, whenever we encounter a patient with isolated hyperbilirubinemia, we have to fractionate the bilirubin into indirect and direct bilirubin. For that, whenever there is direct bilirubin levels more than 15%, it comes under conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. When it is less than 15%, it is unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. When there is unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia, we have to look for hemolysis, massive blood transfusion, and resorption of hematomas, any drug intake, and like rifampin, probenecid, etc., and rule out hereditary conditions like Crigler-Najjar syndrome, Gilbert syndrome, etc. In conjugated hyperbilirubinemia, there are multiple causes. Patient in sepsis, total parental nutrition, cirrhotic patients, bile duct obstruction, drugs, toxins, malignancy, post-surgical patients, and in hereditary conditions like Dubin-Johnson and Rota syndrome. Delta bilirubin, it is nothing but conjugated bilirubin tightly linked to albumin through covalent bonding. Its half-life is similar to the half-life of albumin, which is 14 to 21 days. The significance is prolonged and severe elevation of conjugated bilirubin levels is due to the presence of delta bilirubin. In a patient who is clinically recovering, when there is prolonged elevation of conjugated bilirubin levels in the blood, it is due to delta bilirubin. Coming to urine urobilinogen, and the presence of urine urobilinogen is an indicator of hepatocellular disease, and it is markedly increased in hemolysis. In cholestatic jaundice, it disappears from urine. It is done with the help of Ehrlich's test. Coming to bile salts, It is an important constituent in bile and it is used in diagnosing cholestasis. Conjugated bile acids are called bile salts. The primary bile salts include cholate and phenodeoxycholate, and this is metabolized by the intestinal microbes, and secondary bile salts are formed, lithocholate and deoxycholate. Normally, it is excreted in a negligible amount in urine, whereas in cholestasis, there is increased renal excretion. Coming to the main topic, enzymes in the diagnosis of liver disease. There are two parts, two groups, enzymes of hepatocyte injury and enzymes of cholestasis. In enzymes of hepatocyte injury, aspartate aminotransferase and alanine aminotransferase is there. In cholestatic group, alkaline phosphatase, GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, and 5-nucleotidase is present. This picture shows the location of different enzymes in a hepatocyte. Aspartate aminotransferase enzyme is present both in the cytosol and in the mitochondria, whereas alanine aminotransferase is predominantly a cytosolic enzyme. Alkaline phosphatase and GGT are both present in the canalicular membrane of the hepatocyte. ALT and AST, both these enzymes are elevated whenever there is a hepatocyte injury, not necessarily a hepatocyte death. Whereas alkaline phosphatase and GGT enzymes will be elevated whenever there is a cholestasis, there is increased synthesis of this enzyme and further secretion into the sinusoids. The normal physiology of aminotransferases, AST and ALT are the enzymes involved in transfer of an amino group between aspartate and alanine to ketoglutarate and pyruvate. AST is found in liver, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, kidney, lung, pancreas, RBC, and WBCs, whereas ALT is predominantly found in liver. Hence, ALT elevation is more specific for a liver disorder. The upper limit of normal value for males is 29 to 33 international units per liter, whereas for females it is 19 to 25 international units per liter, according to ACG clinical guidelines. Comparison of AST to ALT. ALT is elevated in most of the chronic liver diseases except for alcohol-induced liver disease until cirrhosis develops, at which point AST will be more than ALT. The ratio of AST to ALT is more than 2. If the ratio of AST to ALT is more than 2 in a patient with probable liver disease, it is strongly suggestive of alcohol as an etiology. And the AST to ALT ratio more than 5 is suggestive of any extrahepatic source of AST, like rhabdomyolysis and acute myocardial infarction, etc. These definitions, according to ACG guidelines, are hepatocellular injury is defined as a disproportionate elevation of aminotransferase levels when compared to ALP levels. Whereas cholestatic injury is defined as disproportionate elevation in alkaline phosphatase levels when compared to aminotransferase levels. Mixed pattern includes both elevation of both these levels. This can be clinically identified with the help of R ratio, which is nothing but the ratio between a patient's ALT value divided by upper limit of normal value of ALT to patient's alkaline phosphatase value divided by upper limit of normal value of ALP. When the ratio is more than 5, it is hepatocellular. If it is less than 2, it is cholestatic. If it is between 2 to 5, mixed pattern. And this picture shows a comparison of LFT aminotransferase elevation due to different etiologies. Normally, it is less than 30. In chronic viral hepatitis and steatohepatitis, the value will be up to 200 to 300, rarely exceeds 300. In alcoholic hepatitis, it will be around 500. Whenever the enzyme levels are more than 1000, it will be due to drug toxicity, acute viral hepatitis, ischemic hepatitis, and acetaminophen overdose. These are the etiologies of increased ALT. Chronic mild ALT elevation is seen in chronic viral hepatitis, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, autoimmune hepatitis, Wilson's hemochromatosis. Non-hepatic causes include celiac disease and hyperthyroidism. A severe acute elevation is seen in acute viral hepatitis, ischemic hepatitis, toxin and drug-induced acetaminophen overdose, acute bile duct obstruction, and acute Budd-Chiari syndrome. And etiologies of elevated AST will be seen in severe acute elevation is seen in hepatic causes include when there is drug or toxin mediated injury in a person with underlying alcohol related liver injury, and non-hepatic cause includes acute rhabdomyolysis, myocardial infarction, etc. Chronic mild elevation is seen in alcohol associated liver injury and non-hepatic causes like hypothyroidism, myopathy, and macro AST, and severe exercises. This picture shows the approach to elevated transaminase levels. Whenever there is a elevated transaminase levels, mild elevation of the transaminase levels, we have to relook the enzyme level and elicit the following history. Like what are the patient's medication, including the over-the-counter drugs, alternative medicines, patient's alcohol, and any drug abuse. If it is found, we have to stop the toxin first. If the history is unrevealing, then we have to do viral serologies, HBsAg and anti-HCV. If HBsAg is positive, we have to do HBe antigen, anti-HBe, and viral DNA levels for hepatitis B. And if anti-HCV is positive, then we have to look for HCV RNA and HCV genotype. Second one is we have to do iron profile, serum iron, serum TIBC levels, and transferrin saturation levels. When the transferrin saturation level is more than 45%, we have to do ferritin levels and HFE gene testing, and if needed, liver biopsy for hemochromatosis patient. And to look for autoimmune hepatitis, we have to do ANA levels. We have to look for ANA and anti-SMA, anti-LKM, and globulin levels. And in a young patient less than 40 to 55 years, look for ceruloplasmin levels. If it is low, then we have to order for slit lamp examination for K-free and 24-hour urinary copper levels and needed liver biopsy. And ultrasound of abdomen for ruling out of fatty liver or steatosis. If the evaluation is still unrevealing, we have to do viral load of HCV viral load, alpha-1 antitrypsin levels, thyroid function test, and TTG antibody levels. If it is still unrevealing, we can go for liver biopsy. Coming to the cholestatic enzymes, alpha phosphatase enzyme is predominantly found on the calanicular membrane, and other sites include bone, placenta, intestine, kidney. This is normally seen elevated in adolescent age groups because of the bone growth, females, pregnancy, blood O and B blood type individuals following a fatty meal. GGT enzyme is found in cell membrane of both hepatocytes and cholangiocytes. It is found in the following sites, and it is isolated elevation does not signify anything. Whenever there is elevation of ALP along GGT, it indicates hepatic origin, and it is elevated in alcohol use, alcoholic abuse, and patients taking anti-epileptics and antiretroviral drugs. These are some of the intrahepatic causes of cholestatic enzyme elevation, predominantly drugs, primary biliary cirrhosis, primary sclerosing cholangitis, granulomatous liver disease, sarcoidosis, viral hepatitis, and genetic conditions including PFIC and benign recurrent intrahepatic cholestasis, malignancy, and infiltrative diseases. Extrahepatic causes of cholestatic enzyme elevation, it can be intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic causes includes ascariasis, choledocholithiasis, cholangiocarcinoma, infections, malignancy. Extrinsic causes include gallbladder cancer, Mirizi syndrome, pancreatic cancer, pancreatic pseudocyst, etc. Whenever there is this picture shows the evaluation of isolated ALP elevation. Whenever there is isolated ALP elevation, first we have to either fractionate or we can measure GGT and 5-nucleotidase levels. If both are elevated, it is of liver origin. If only ALP is elevated, we have to look for other origin of ALP. Then the second step would be reviewing the drug list and measure the AMA levels for ruling out primary biliary cirrhosis, ACE levels for sarcoidosis, and ultrasound of abdomen. In the ultrasound of abdomen, when the ducts are dilated, it is due to extrahepatic cholestasis. Then we will go for higher imaging like CT and MRCP. When the ducts are not dilated, then we have to look for the intrahepatic causes of cholestasis, like already said, AMA levels, AC levels, viral serologies. If it is still negative, then we have to go do MRCP and liver biopsy. Low ALP is seen in the following conditions: hypothyroidism, pernicious anemia, zinc deficiency, and in case of acute liver failure due to Wilson's, the ratio of ALP to total bilirubin level will be less than 4. Tests based on synthetic function includes plasma protein levels and prothrombin time. And in plasma protein levels, albumin is synthesized exclusively by hepatocytes, the half-life of which is 14 to 21 days. The long T-half is an unreliable marker for acute liver injury. So whenever we see a patient with low serum levels in a newly detected hepatitis, we should suspect a chronic underlying process. Apart from that, there can be other causes of low albumin like malnutrition, increased renal or GI loss, and like nephrotic syndrome, protein losing enteropathy, and internal redistribution. Coming to globulins, there are 3 alpha, beta, and gamma globulins. Alpha and beta are synthesized in the liver, whereas gamma globulin is synthesized in the plasma cells. And in cirrhosis, the gamma globulin levels will be increased whenever because antibodies formed against bacterial antigens are not effectively cleared in case of cirrhosis, and albumin synthesis is slow in cirrhotic liver. So hence AG reversal will be seen in cirrhosis of liver, and polyclonal gamma globulin level will be high in autoimmune hepatitis, and IgM level will be high in primary biliary cirrhosis. Coming to coagulation factors, all the coagulation factors are synthesized in the liver except factor 8, and there are wide half-life range. 6 hours for factor 7 to 5 days for fibrinogen levels, and it is a best measure for hepatic synthetic function or for acute function of liver. Prothrombin time is it measures the extrinsic pathway, and it measures the rate of conversion of prothrombin to thrombin, which requires factor 2, 5, 7, and 10, which are all vitamin K dependent, and it is required for gamma carboxylation. And the prothrombin time is prolonged in liver disease patients undergoing anticoagulant therapy, vitamin K deficiency, and consumptive coagulopathy. One practical way to differentiate prolonged prothrombin time due to DICM from intrinsic liver disease is measurement of factor 8 levels, because factor 8 level will be low in DIC, whereas it will be normal in intrinsic liver disease. The measurement of INR is necessary in liver disease patients because it is used in calculating MEL score, which predicts the 3-month mortality rate of such patients, and it is also useful for selecting patients for liver transplantation. Ceruloplasmin levels, normal values between 20 to 40. It is acute phase protein. It is decreasing in the following conditions like Wilson's-Menkes disease, aceruloplasminemia, copper deficiency. It is increased in copper toxicity, pregnancy in patients taking OC pills. This picture shows the common patterns of liver function abnormalities. In hepatocellular, there will be predominant aminotransferase elevation, and when compared to cholestatic enzyme, and the bilirubin will be high, albumin will be low, and prothrombin time will be can be normal or elevated. In cholestatic, only cholestatic enzymes will be predominantly elevated, and aminotransferase will be normal or mild to moderately elevated. Bilirubin will be very high in cholestatic jaundice, cholestatic liver injuries. And isolated hyperbilirubinemia, only bilirubin levels will be elevated, other things will be normal. Synthetic dysfunction, isolated synthetic dysfunction, the albumin levels will be low and prothrombin will be high, and other enzymes might be normal. A quantitative excretion test, it is used to detect the functional hepatic mass, ideally the correct function of the liver. There are 3 synthetic dye excretion tests using bromosulfonane, indocyanine, green clearance, and Rose-Beng test. The other excretory test includes galactose elimination capacity, caffeine clearance test, lidocaine metabolic formation, and aminoperin breath test. And these detect the actual function of the liver. My references are from Schlesinger and ACG Clinical Guidelines, 2016, Evaluation of Abnormal Liver Chemistries. Thank you.
So, Dr. Himamala, there are some questions on the chat box.
Yeah. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Shiny. So there is a question, Shiny. What is the role of serum protein electrophoresis in evaluation of abnormal LFT? So when would you consider a protein electrophoresis?
So primary biliary IgM levels will be high, and polyclonal immunoglobulins will be high in primary biliary cirrhosis. In cirrhotic
So normally, just for the routine evaluation of liver test, we don't do protein electrophoresis. But when we suspect that the gamma globulins are unusually high, and we are suspecting some kind of, disease or disorders like multiple myeloma, then we will go for it. The protein electrophoresis. Otherwise, you can of course do electrophoresis separate. IgM is high or IgG is high, but generally we don't use it as a routine evaluation for liver disorders.
Yes.
Why is vitamin K given only for 3 days? So, as far as I know, usually one dose is enough to reverse, coagulopathy with warfarin generally. So this is so I am not aware of any specific reason why it should be given for more than 3 days. But usually for warfarin-induced coagulopathy, even one dose is enough to reverse it. Even 10 milligram one dose. There is one more question, Shiny. Albumin is also a negative acute phase reactant. So how to differentiate that low albumin is due to the acute condition, that is sepsis or inflammation, or a chronic condition? So we have to see this as a whole. So we have to see the value of albumin along with the other liver tests. So is there evidence of chronic liver disease from the other tests? So like we look at the platelet count, we look at the AST-ALT ratio. So all those things we look at it, and then we suspect whether the patient has got cirrhosis. Like if AST is more than ALT, we think he probably has cirrhosis. The platelets are low, we think he probably has cirrhosis. But if it is not so, if they are all normal and we see just albumin, we look at the history. Sepsis is there, obviously inflammation is there, then the diagnosis will be more towards that.
Yes, sir.
So, Shiny, do you think the TEG can be included in the liver function test, and what is the value of TEG in the day-to-day practice?
I'm
talking about TEG, thromboelastogram.
Thromboelastogram. First coagulation.
So she's just joined us, so hardly 2 weeks.
Sometimes you use the TEG machine to find out whether you need to give cryoprecipitate, you need to give platelets, what factors, so that you have various parameters for doing TEG. And for liver transplantation during the procedure, it is very, very important. But otherwise, also it has been found that in invasive procedures in patients with liver disease, if you use TEG, it can tell you whether actually what is deficient, if at all, whether there's increased fibrinolysis, whether there's increased platelets. So all these parameters can be used, and some of us have been using TEG and have found it to be useful, though it's still a very controversial issue. Transplantation program, I think it's a must. During the liver transplantation, what blood products you have to give, you decide by TEG, though it is traditionally not included in the function test.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir.
So there was some question on the previous presentation. I think I was talking about this FLIP device for assessment of POEM in achalasia cardia, both before and after. Some of the centers in India are using it. So this gives a good assessment whether POEM procedure is effective or not. It not only gives you the diameter in the cross-sectional area, but also gives you distensibility and likely to increase and improve after POEM procedure. So FLIP is being used, FLIP device or EndoFLIP as it is called, is used for assessment of success of POEM. So that was a question which was left unanswered in the first presentation. Dr. Hemamala, do you actually use these ICG and other tests in the day-to-day practice?
No, sir. I'm not using actually. We are not using.
So the other question was, what is the rate of esophageal stricture formation post-POEM procedure? That is again related to the first presentation. I think stricture is distinctly uncommon, though the reflux is much more common. So stricture formation will be very, very rare after a good POEM procedure. So if there are no more questions, any final comments from the faculty from Mayot Hospital, Dr. Hemamala and Dr. Manoj?
No, sir. Thank you. Thank you for giving us this opportunity, sir.
So thank you, the two presenters, Dr. Ravi and Dr. Shaini, and both the faculty. And we'll wind up with this. Dr. Singh. Navneet, you want to make any final comment?
Yeah, thank you very much to the trainees for the presentation, and thank you very much, Dr. Hemamala, Dr. Manoj, and Dr. Goenka for joining us. Thank you, students, for joining us.
Thank you, Navneet. So next Monday, tune in for listening to Dr. Uday Ghoshal, approach to an abdominal lump. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.